September 27th, 1810. Dawn breaks over a ridge in central Portugal called Busaco. 25,000 British and Portuguese soldiers wait on the reverse slope, hidden from view. Climbing toward them through the mist are 65,000 French veterans commanded by Marshal André Masséna, one of Napoleon's finest commanders. The French believe they're pursuing a beaten enemy. They're wrong. Over the next 6 hours, Wellington will demonstrate why defensive positions, properly used, can shatter armies twice their size. French columns will climb exhausted up steep slopes, only to find British lines appearing at point-blank range, delivering volleys that tear through packed formations. By noon, 4,500 Frenchmen will be casualties, and Masséna's invasion will be crippled. This is the battle that proved Wellington's tactical system, validated Portuguese troops, and bought time for the most ambitious defensive works in military history. If you're ready to see how terrain, training, and tactical genius defeat raw numbers, smash that like button and subscribe, because this is the battle where 25,000 held the line against impossible odds. By the autumn of 1810, the Peninsular War had been bleeding France for 3 years. Napoleon's decision to occupy Spain in 1807 and Portugal in 1808 had seemed straightforward. Iberia was weak, divided, and ripe for conquest. But Spain erupted in guerrilla warfare, and Britain sent an expeditionary force under Sir Arthur Wellesley, soon to be the Duke of Wellington, to Portugal. What Napoleon expected to be a brief police action became a festering wound that drained French resources and tied down hundreds of thousands of troops. Wellington had already proven himself dangerous. At Talavera in July 1809, his combined British and Spanish force had fought Marshal Victor to a standstill, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing French withdrawal. Wellington earned his peerage from that battle, but the strategic situation remained precarious. He commanded perhaps 30,000 British troops in Portugal, supplemented by Portuguese forces of questionable reliability. Against him, Napoleon was concentrating overwhelming strength. The French strategy for 1810 was annihilation. 3 armies would invade Portugal simultaneously, crushing British resistance and driving Wellington into the sea. Marshal Masséna commanded the Army of Portugal, over 65,000 veterans, experienced soldiers who'd fought across Europe, supported by cavalry and artillery. These weren't conscripts or garrison troops. They were the Grande Armée, Napoleon's instrument of conquest, and they were coming for Wellington. Masséna himself was a legend. The dear child of victory, Napoleon called him. He'd risen from poverty to marshal's rank through sheer military genius, winning battles in Italy, Switzerland, and Austria. At the Siege of Genoa in 1800, he'd held a starving city against Austrian forces for months, eventually negotiating honourable terms despite being outnumbered and surrounded. He was 52 years old in 1810, one-eyed from a hunting accident, still sharp, still dangerous. Napoleon trusted him to accomplish what other marshals had failed to do: destroy Wellington. Wellington understood the mathematics perfectly. He couldn't match French numbers in open battle. His British regiments were superb, disciplined, well-trained, capable of devastating fire. But there weren't enough of them. The Portuguese army, recently reorganized under British officers, was improving, but untested. Spanish allies were unreliable, their armies repeatedly defeated by French forces. If Wellington tried to defend Portugal conventionally, Masséna would simply concentrate superior numbers and crush him. So Wellington didn't fight conventionally. In July 1810, as Masséna's army crossed into Portugal, Wellington began a fighting retreat. It looked like defeat. British forces fell back toward Lisbon, skirmishing with French advance units, but refusing major engagement. The Portuguese population retreated with them, entire villages evacuating, taking livestock and supplies, leaving nothing for the French. Wellington's orders were explicit: deny the French everything, burn crops, drive off animals, poison wells, make Portugal a desert that would starve Masséna's army even as it advanced. The scorched earth policy was brutal but effective. French soldiers marched through empty villages, finding abandoned homes and barren fields. Their supply lines stretched back to Spain, hundreds of miles through hostile territory where Spanish guerrillas ambushed convoys and cut communications. Masséna's army began experiencing supply shortages, even as it pursued what appeared to be a beaten enemy. Wellington's Light Division conducted the rearguard action brilliantly. Commanded by Robert Craufurd, Black Bob to his men, a hard disciplinarian with tactical genius, the Light Division fought a series of delaying actions through August and September. They'd occupy defensive positions, bloody French advance units, then withdraw before being overwhelmed. At the combat of Coa in July, Craufurd nearly got his division destroyed through excessive aggression, but learned his lesson and fought more cautiously afterward. The retreat accomplished exactly what Wellington intended. It bought time. Since late 1809, British engineers and Portuguese labourers had been constructing fortifications north of Lisbon, the lines of Torres Vedras. These weren't field entrenchments. They were permanent fortifications, 126 miles of interconnected redoubts, forts, artillery positions, and earthworks designed to make Lisbon impregnable. The project was conducted in secrecy, screened from French intelligence, employing thousands of workers over more than a year. By September 1810, the lines were nearly complete, but they needed a few more weeks. Masséna pursued confidently. His army had won skirmishes, occupied Portuguese territory, and driven British forces back toward the coast. He believed Wellington was near breaking point, that one more push would shatter British resistance. When Wellington halted his retreat at Busaco Ridge on September 25th, Masséna saw opportunity. Finally, the British would stand and fight. Finally, he could bring his superior numbers to bear and crush them decisively. Wellington's position ran along a 10-mile ridge near the village of Busaco. The ridge was steep on the French side, in places nearly vertical cliffs, rising over 1,800 feet above the surrounding terrain. There was a convent at the highest point, which Wellington used as his command post. Behind the ridge, good roads allowed British forces to move laterally and withdraw if necessary. Only a few rough tracks led up the French-facing slopes, and those were steep, exhausting climbs that would disorder any attacking formation. Wellington deployed his army carefully over September 25th and 26th. British divisions held key sectors, with Portuguese brigades integrated throughout the line rather than segregated. This was intentional. Wellington trusted his Portuguese troops more than many British officers did, and he wanted them fighting alongside British regulars where their steadiness would be visible. The Light Division under Craufurd held the northern flank. The 3rd Division under Thomas Picton, a tough Welsh officer with a talent for profanity and aggressive tactics, held the southern sector. Other divisions filled the centre. Critically, Wellington positioned most of his troops on the reverse slope, the side of the ridge facing away from the French. This wasn't cowardice or caution. It was tactical brilliance refined over years of peninsular fighting. Troops on the reverse slope were invisible to French observers and protected from French artillery fire. They could rest in relative safety whilst French forces exhausted themselves climbing steep slopes. When French columns crested the ridge, expecting to deploy and fight, they'd instead find British lines waiting at point-blank range, fresh and ready. Masséna's reconnaissance failed him. His cavalry couldn't get close enough to the ridge to assess British positions properly. British and Portuguese light infantry were screening the approaches. French observers could see the ridge itself, but not what lay behind it. Masséna assumed Wellington had deployed conventionally, on the forward slope where defenders usually positioned themselves. He planned a straightforward assault. 2 columns would attack simultaneously, one in the north commanded by Marshal Ney, one in the south under General Régnier. 65,000 men against what Masséna believed were 25,000 demoralized British and untested Portuguese. The French would sweep over the ridge, and Wellington would finally be destroyed. What Masséna didn't understand was that Wellington had chosen Busaco not to make a final stand, but to fight a delaying action under perfect conditions. Win or lose, Wellington planned to withdraw toward the lines of Torres Vedras within 48 hours. But he'd give Masséna a battle first, on ground of Wellington's choosing, using tactics the French still hadn't learned to counter, with troops positioned for maximum advantage. The French were about to climb into a killing ground, and they had no idea what awaited them at the top. The Busaco Ridge wasn't just high ground, it was a natural fortress stretching 10 miles north to south. Stand at the base looking up, and the ridge rises like a wall, steep slopes covered in scrub and rock that channeled attackers into predictable paths. The French side was brutally steep, in some sections requiring hands to climb. The reverse slope, the eastern side where Wellington positioned his troops, was gentler, allowing easy movement and comfortable positions for resting soldiers. Between these two faces ran a ridgeline narrow enough that troops crossing it would be exposed, visible, vulnerable. Wellington arrived at the ridge on September 25th and spent hours riding the position, studying every fold of ground, every dip and rise, memorizing the terrain with the obsessive attention to detail that characterized his generalship. He wasn't just looking at the ridge itself, but understanding how attackers would experience it, where they'd be exhausted, where their formations would compress, where they'd expect to find defenders, and where they'd actually encounter them. The convent of Busaco sat near the highest point, a stone monastery that Wellington converted into his command post. From its tower, you could observe the entire battlefield, watch French movements in the valley below, and see clear to the horizon. Wellington would spend the battle moving between the convent and critical points along the ridge, appearing wherever the fighting was heaviest, directing reinforcements with the precision of a chess master moving pieces. His deployment reflected hard-won experience. The northern flank, starting near the convent and running northward, went to the Light Division under Crawford. These were the elite light infantry and riflemen, the 43rd, 52nd and 95th regiments, trained for rapid movement, independent action, and devastating firepower. Crawford was difficult, demanding, harsh with his men, but they were the best infantry in Wellington's army, and they knew it. They'd been fighting the rearguard for months, bloodying French noses and withdrawing before they could be pinned. Now they'd stand and deliver something more substantial. The centre divisions, the 1st under Brent Spencer and the 5th under James Leith, held the ridgeline between the Light Division and Picton's sector. These were solid line infantry, British regulars supplemented by King's German Legion battalions. They'd wait on the reverse slope, invisible to French observers, ready to meet whatever came over the crest. The southern sector belonged to Thomas Picton's 3rd Division. Picton was 52 years old, a career soldier who'd served in the West Indies before coming to Portugal. He was profane, irascible, frequently wore civilian clothes instead of uniform, and possessed an aggressive tactical instinct that made him invaluable in defensive battles. His division included the 88th Regiment, the Connaught Rangers, Irish troops with a fearsome reputation for bayonet work. Picton's sector also included Portuguese brigades under British officers, specifically positioned where they'd face the hardest fighting. This wasn't punishment, it was trust. Wellington needed to prove Portuguese troops could stand against French veterans, and Picton's aggressive leadership would support them. The Portuguese component of Wellington's army deserves emphasis because British contemporaries often dismissed them as unreliable. After all, Portuguese armies had been repeatedly defeated by French forces in previous campaigns. But Wellington saw potential where others saw weakness. Starting in 1809, he'd appointed British officers to reform Portuguese regiments, training them in British drill, tactics, and discipline. Marshal William Beresford led this reorganisation, essentially rebuilding the Portuguese army from the ground up. By September 1810, Portuguese brigades were integrated into Wellington's line, fighting alongside British regulars. Busaco would be their first major test. Artillery was positioned behind the crest where possible, ready to fire over the ridge at French columns, climbing toward them, but protected from counter-battery fire. Wellington's artillery was outnumbered by French guns, but positioning mattered more than numbers. French artillery down in the valley could blast away at the ridge all day without hitting troops sheltered on the reverse slope. The tactical advantage of this position was profound. When you hide troops on a reverse slope, the enemy can't see them. French commanders planning their assault had no idea how many defenders waited or exactly where they were positioned. French artillery couldn't target what they couldn't see. French skirmishers couldn't report on defensive positions because the positions were invisible from their side. Masséna was essentially attacking blind. More importantly, French troops climbing those steep slopes would arrive at the crest exhausted, their formations disordered by the climb, their officers struggling to maintain control over men spread out by terrain. Attacking in column, the standard French formation, worked brilliantly on flat ground where columns could advance rapidly, then deploy into line for firefights. But climbing steep slopes in column meant the front ranks reached the top first, gasping for breath, while rear ranks were still struggling upward. There was no time or space to deploy into line before British volleys would crash into them. Wellington had used reverse slope positioning before, at Talavera and other engagements, but Busaco's terrain made it devastatingly effective. The French would climb into a trap. They'd crest the ridge expecting to find defenders and have time to deploy for battle. Instead, they'd find British lines formed and waiting at 50 yards distance, rested troops who'd watched them climb, who'd aimed their muskets whilst French soldiers struggled upward. The first French soldiers knew of British positions would be when those positions erupted in controlled volleys that could deliver 3, sometimes 4 shots per minute into packed formations. Masséna should have recognized the danger. He'd fought in Italy and Switzerland, in mountainous terrain where positions like Busaco could be deadly, but he was confident, perhaps overconfident. His army outnumbered Wellington's by nearly 3-1. His soldiers were veterans of a dozen campaigns. Wellington had been retreating for months, and armies in retreat are demoralized armies, or so conventional wisdom said. Masséna planned a direct assault, trusting French elan and numerical superiority to overcome whatever defensive advantages Wellington possessed. Marshal Ney would lead the northern assault. Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave, was 41 years old, a red-haired, hot-tempered marshal who'd risen from enlisted ranks through sheer courage and tactical aggression. He'd fought in Germany, Austria, and Spain, earning Napoleon's trust and the devotion of his troops. Ney believed in attack, in momentum, in the moral superiority of offensive action. Faced with a steep ridge and hidden defenders, Ney's response was characteristically direct. Assault it with overwhelming force. General Régnier would command the southern assault with 17,000 troops. He was more cautious than Ney, more methodical, but he followed the same tactical doctrine. Column attacks, supported by skirmishers and artillery. The plan was to assault simultaneously from north and south, dividing British attention and overwhelming defenders through sheer weight of numbers. Both attacks would fail, but for the same reason. They were climbing into positions prepared by a general who understood defensive warfare better than anyone in Europe, using tactics refined through years of peninsular fighting, facing troops trained to exploit every advantage terrain could provide. The French were brave, experienced, and numerous. But they were about to learn that courage and numbers don't overcome tactical disadvantage, especially when the disadvantage is this severe. Wellington spent the night of September 26th riding the ridge, checking positions, speaking with divisional commanders, ensuring everyone understood the plan. His instructions were simple. Wait on the reverse slope until French columns crest the ridge, then advance to the crest and deliver controlled volleys into their formations. If they break, pursue with bayonets. If they stand, maintain fire discipline and let British musketry do its work. Trust the Portuguese brigades. They'll hold if British regulars show confidence in them. And watch for his signals, because if the position became untenable, they'd withdraw that night toward Torres Vedras. As dawn broke on September 27th, 70,000 men were positioned across a few miles of Portuguese ridgeline. French campfires dotted the valley below. British and Portuguese soldiers checked their muskets, fixed flints, arranged cartridge boxes for quick reloading. Light infantry and riflemen moved forward to screening positions. Artillery crews positioned their guns. And Wellington waited at the convent, watching French columns begin to form in the valley, knowing what was coming, knowing his preparations would be tested within the hour. Masséna's assault was about to begin, and the French had no idea they were climbing toward a perfectly designed killing ground. Dawn came grey and misty on September 27th, the kind of morning where sound carries strangely and visibility shifts with the fog. French drums began beating around 6 a.m., the rhythm that meant advance, attack, move forward. Marshal Ney's northern column, over 10,000 troops organized into 3 divisions, started their climb toward the light division's positions. These were veterans, men who'd marched across Europe with Napoleon's eagles, who'd stormed fortifications and broken enemy lines from Italy to Prussia. They approached the slope with confidence born of experience, forming their standard attack columns, battalion after battalion, arranged in tight rectangular formations, each column about 100 men wide and several ranks deep. The column formation was the Grande Armée's signature tactic. It combined mobility with shock power. Columns could move quickly across battlefields, could charge with psychological impact. That mass of men advancing behind drums and eagles was terrifying to face. Once engaged, columns could theoretically deploy into line, spreading out to bring maximum musketry to bear. The system had worked brilliantly across Europe against Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies. But it had a critical weakness that Wellington understood perfectly. Columns were vulnerable to disciplined linear formations that could deliver sustained fire. The mathematics were brutal. A French column might be 100 men wide at its front, but only those front ranks could fire their muskets effectively, perhaps 100 muskets shooting forward. A British 2-rank line facing that column could position 300 men along the same frontage, all firing simultaneously. 300 muskets against 100, and the British infantry were trained to fire faster than their continental counterparts, 3 to 4 rounds per minute from drilled regulars who'd spent years perfecting their craft. Ney's columns began climbing around 6:30 a.m. The slope was steep enough that soldiers had to lean forward, using hands to steady themselves on rocks, their formations compressing as the terrain channeled them into narrower paths. Officers shouted encouragement, keeping men moving despite exhaustion that came quickly at that incline. The mist obscured the crest. They could see perhaps 50 yards ahead, nothing beyond. They expected to find defenders somewhere near the top, expected to deploy and fight, expected their numbers and momentum to carry the position. Craufurd had positioned the light division precisely. The 43rd and 52nd regiments, light infantry trained for flexibility and marksmanship, waited on the reverse slope about 30 yards back from the crest. The 95th Rifles were forward in skirmishing positions, using their accurate Baker rifles to snipe at French officers as the columns climbed. But the main lines were invisible to French forces struggling upward. The first French soldiers reached the crest around 7 a.m., gasping from the climb, their formations stretched and disordered. They expected to see British positions ahead, expected to have time and space to organize for assault. Instead, they heard a shouted command in English, and 300 yards ahead, British lines stood up from the reverse slope and marched forward to the crest. The shock was physical. Here were the defenders, not scattered skirmishers, but formed lines, muskets leveled, calm, as if on a parade ground. Fire! The volley crashed out at perhaps 40 yards distance. Smoke erupted along the British line. The front ranks of the French column simply disintegrated, men falling, screaming, the shock of massed musketry at close range tearing through packed formations. Before the French could react, British soldiers were reloading with practiced speed. Tear cartridge with teeth, pour powder down barrel, ram ball and wadding, cock hammer, aim, fire. 15 seconds for trained men. Another volley, another. The French column wavered, tried to deploy, couldn't. There was no room on that narrow crest, and men were falling too quickly. Then came the bayonets. British infantry fixed bayonets and charged downhill into the disordered French column. This wasn't a wild rush, but a controlled advance, maintaining formation, using momentum and terror. French soldiers, exhausted from the climb and battered by volley fire, broke and ran back down the slope. British pursuers stopped at a predetermined point, reformed their lines, and waited for the next assault. Ney wasn't finished. He reformed his columns in the valley and ordered a second attack. More drums, more advancing troops, same steep climb. This time they knew British positions awaited at the top, but French tactical doctrine demanded offensive action. Attack again, with more force, break through by sheer determination. The second assault met the same reception. Volleys at close range, bayonet charges, French retreat down slopes littered with casualties. Some French units got tangled with retreating comrades, creating chaos at the base of the ridge. The 95th Rifles inflicted disproportionate damage throughout these assaults. Armed with Baker rifles that were accurate to 300 yards, compared to muskets 80 yards, the riflemen picked off French officers with deliberate precision. Remove the officers, and columns lost cohesion. French soldiers were brave, but without officers to maintain discipline under fire, courage wasn't enough against systematic destruction. By 9 a.m., Ney's attacks had failed decisively. His divisions had suffered over 2,000 casualties without reaching British lines in force. The light division's casualties were comparatively minimal, perhaps 300 men. The tactical disparity was stark. French soldiers fought courageously, climbing those slopes repeatedly, despite watching comrades fall. But courage can't overcome mathematics. 300 muskets firing into 100 always wins, especially when the 300 are fresh and the 100 are exhausted. Meanwhile, Reynier's southern assault was developing into the battle's genuine crisis. His 17,000 troops attacked the sector held by Picton's 3rd Division and Portuguese brigades around 8 a.m. The terrain here was slightly different, still steep, but with more approaches, making it harder to concentrate defensive fire on single paths. Reynier's columns climbed in multiple places simultaneously, spreading the defensive challenge across a wider frontage. The Portuguese brigades were positioned directly in the path of Reynier's main thrust. British officers watching them knew this was the test. Would Portuguese troops stand against French veterans, or would they break and run as Portuguese armies had done in previous campaigns? The answer came quickly. They stood. Portuguese infantry maintained formation as French columns crested the ridge, delivered controlled volleys, and held their ground when French soldiers tried to close with bayonets. But Reynier's assault had weight behind it. One French column managed to establish a foothold on the crest, actually pushing Portuguese troops back several yards. This was the crisis moment. If French forces could maintain that foothold and funnel more troops onto the ridgeline, they might break through. The battle was balanced on a knife's edge. Wellington saw the danger and sent orders to Picton. Counterattack immediately, drive them back. Picton needed no encouragement. He'd been watching the Portuguese hold their position with approval, but now British regulars would finish what the Portuguese had started. The 88th Regiment, the Connaught Rangers, fixed bayonets and prepared to charge. 88th, forward! Picton's voice carried across the chaos. The Irish regiment surged forward, maintaining formation despite the slope, smashing into the French foothold with controlled fury. The French troops, exhausted from their climb and already engaged with Portuguese units, couldn't withstand the fresh assault. They broke, streaming back down the slope. Portuguese troops on the flanks advanced alongside the 88th, proving they could attack as well as defend. The counterattack swept French forces off the crest and down the slope. Reynier attempted to rally his divisions for another assault, but the momentum was gone. His troops had climbed those slopes, fought at the top, been driven back, and the prospect of climbing again into those waiting volleys was too much. By 10 a.m., Reynier's assault had stalled, his forces pulling back to regroup and count their casualties. The battle wasn't quite finished. Sporadic fighting continued until noon as French commanders tried to find some avenue for success. But the decisive phase was over by mid-morning. French columns had attacked the ridge from north and south, had climbed those brutal slopes multiple times, had fought courageously against well-positioned defenders, and had been comprehensively defeated. The casualties told the story. Approximately 4,500 French soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Allied casualties were around 1,250, roughly 1/4 of French losses, despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1. Masséna's great assault had achieved nothing except proving that Wellington's defensive system worked exactly as designed. The French had attacked with numerical superiority, veteran troops, and aggressive commanders. None of it mattered against properly positioned defenders on favorable terrain, using tactics that exploited every advantage. The Battle of Busaco was a defensive masterclass, and the French had just received an expensive education in why attacking Wellington on ground of his choosing was a catastrophic mistake. The sun climbed higher through the afternoon of September 27th, burning off the morning mist to reveal the full scope of French failure. Bodies dotted the slopes, French soldiers who'd fallen during the climbs or been shot retreating. The wounded cried out for water, for help, for an end to pain. British and Portuguese medical personnel descended to retrieve their own casualties, whilst French stretcher-bearers did what they could for theirs. The smell of gunpowder lingered, mixed with the copper scent of blood and the acrid stench of burned powder from thousands of musket discharges. Masséna surveyed the battlefield from the valley with the expression of a man confronting an unwelcome truth. He'd commanded armies for 2 decades, won battles across Europe, earned his marshal's baton through victories that lesser generals couldn't conceive. Now he'd thrown his army against a ridge and been comprehensively repulsed. The casualty reports filtering back confirmed what he could see with his own eyes. 4,500 men gone, dead, wounded, or too scattered to be effective, without achieving anything except proving Wellington's position was stronger than anticipated. The disparity in casualties was humiliating. Masséna's army outnumbered Wellington's forces nearly 3-1, yet French casualties were more than triple Allied losses. British and Portuguese forces had stood on a ridge and systematically destroyed French attacks without being seriously threatened. The mathematics of the battle revealed tactical superiority that numbers couldn't overcome. When defenders are positioned to exploit terrain advantages, when they're well trained and properly led, numerical inferiority becomes irrelevant. But Masséna's problems went beyond a single battle. His army was operating at the end of extended supply lines through hostile territory. The scorched earth policy had left Portugal barren, villages empty, fields burned, livestock driven off. French soldiers were already on reduced rations, and the army's magazines held perhaps 2 weeks of supplies if they were careful. Sitting outside Busaco trying to starve out Wellington wasn't an option. The British had supply routes to the sea and could be resupplied indefinitely through Portuguese ports. The French were slowly starving whilst the enemy ate regularly. Masséna considered his options. Frontal assault had failed bloodily. Could he flank the position? The ridge stretched 10 miles. Surely there was a way around. His scouts began searching for paths around Wellington's northern or southern flanks, but the terrain was difficult, and any flanking movement would be slow, giving Wellington time to respond. The fundamental problem remained. Wellington didn't need to hold Busaco forever, only long enough to delay French advance, and he'd already accomplished that objective. Wellington made his decision that afternoon. He'd fought his battle, inflicted heavy casualties, proven Portuguese troops could stand against French veterans, and bought additional time for the lines of Torres Vedras. Now he'd withdraw as planned. Orders went out to divisional commanders. Prepare for night withdrawal on September 27th, 28th. The wounded would be evacuated first. Artillery would move under cover of darkness. Infantry would follow in sequence, maintaining rear guards to prevent French interference. It would be executed with the same meticulous planning that characterized Wellington's defensive positions. The withdrawal began after nightfall. British and Portuguese forces slipped away from the ridge in darkness, moving along pre-planned routes toward defensive lines they'd prepared further back. Rear guards remained until dawn to conceal the movement, maintaining campfires and sending out patrols to create the impression of normal activity. By the time French scouts realized the ridge was nearly empty, Wellington's army was miles away, marching toward Lisbon in perfect order. Masséna discovered the withdrawal at dawn on September 28th. French patrols climbing the ridge found abandoned positions and cold campfires. Wellington had vanished during the night, extracting his entire army without French forces detecting the movement. For Masséna, it was another frustration. He'd lost 4,000 men, attacking a position Wellington had already planned to abandon. The battle had been meaningless from a territorial perspective. Wellington didn't need to hold Busaco permanently. He'd needed to delay French advance and damage French morale whilst inflicting disproportionate casualties. He'd accomplished all three objectives perfectly. But Masséna wasn't ready to give up. Wellington was retreating toward Lisbon, and retreat meant weakness, or so French doctrine insisted. Masséna ordered pursuit. His army, reduced by casualties and desertion, followed British forces southward through October. French soldiers marched through the same empty countryside British forces had traversed, finding the same barren fields and abandoned villages. Supply became critical. Men were on half rations, horses were dying from lack of forage, and the army's effectiveness degraded daily. On October 10, 1810, Masséna's advance guard reached a position north of Lisbon and received a shock that dwarfed Busaco's tactical surprise. Stretching across the landscape, blocking every approach to Lisbon, were fortifications of staggering scale. The lines of Torres Vedras, 126 miles of interconnected redoubts, artillery positions, and earthworks manned by militia and regular troops, anchored on impassable terrain and supplied from the sea. The fortifications had been built in secret over 18 months, employing thousands of Portuguese labourers under British engineering direction. Masséna had known vaguely about defensive works near Lisbon, but nothing prepared him for what he now faced. The lines consisted of three defensive belts. The first stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Tagus River, studded with 152 redoubts, mounting over 600 cannons. The second line, 6 miles behind the first, provided fallback positions. The third line protected Lisbon itself and the embarkation points if evacuation became necessary. British engineers had selected the ground expertly, using rivers, marshes, and steep slopes to channel any attackers into killing zones covered by interlocking fields of fire. Artillery could sweep approaches with canister and round shot. Infantry in the redoubts could deliver sustained musketry against anything that came within range. Masséna stared at the fortifications and understood he'd been outmaneuvered strategically. Wellington's retreat hadn't been weakness. It had been deliberate withdrawal to prepared positions. The entire Portuguese campaign had been planned to lure French forces deep into territory where they'd starve whilst besieging impregnable fortifications. Busaco had been a delaying action, buying time to complete these works. Now French forces faced a choice: assault fortifications that made Busaco look easy, or sit outside Lisbon and slowly starve. Masséna chose the latter, hoping something would change, that reinforcements might arrive or supplies could be secured from the Portuguese interior. His army dug in facing the lines, establishing what would become a miserable winter encampment. October passed into November, November into December, and the French army withered. Disease spread through the camps: dysentery, typhus, fevers born of poor sanitation and inadequate food. Men deserted, either trying to make their way back to Spain or surrendering to Portuguese guerrillas who weren't known for mercy. Horses died by the hundreds, their carcasses adding to the sanitation nightmare. Wellington's forces inside the lines were comfortable. British ships supplied them through Lisbon's port with food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Portuguese civilians who'd retreated with the army were housed and fed. The troops ate regularly, remained healthy, and watched French forces deteriorate through the winter. Occasionally, British cavalry would sortie from the lines to harass French positions, but mostly Wellington waited patiently for starvation and disease to do his work. By March 1811, Masséna accepted reality. His army had been reduced from 65,000 effectives to perhaps 40,000, many of those weakened by disease and malnutrition. He couldn't assault the lines. That would be suicide. He couldn't remain where he was. His army would cease to exist through attrition. On March 5, 1811, Masséna ordered withdrawal. The French retreat from Portugal began, harried by British and Portuguese forces, losing more men to exhaustion, disease, and ambush. Napoleon's great Portuguese offensive had ended in comprehensive failure. Masséna would be recalled and relieved of command. Wellington would be elevated to field marshal and given expanded authority. More importantly, the strategic initiative in the Peninsular War had shifted permanently. The French would never again seriously threaten Lisbon. Within a year, Wellington would be advancing into Spain, carrying the war to French-occupied territory, beginning the offensive phase that would eventually push French forces back across the Pyrenees into France itself. And it all traced back to that September morning on Busaco Ridge, where 25,000 men had held a position against 65,000 attackers, where Portuguese troops had proven their worth, where Wellington's tactical system had been validated beyond any doubt. Busaco was the battle that bought time for Torres Vedras. Torres Vedras destroyed Masséna's army without another major battle. And that destruction changed the Peninsular War's trajectory, contributing ultimately to Napoleon's downfall. The tactical principles that won Busaco weren't accidents or improvisation. They were the product of Wellington's systematic study of warfare, refined through years of peninsular combat, based on understanding both his army's strengths and enemy weaknesses. To understand why Busaco worked so perfectly, we need to examine the military science behind Wellington's defensive doctrine and why French commanders kept walking into the same tactical trap, despite repeated bloody lessons. The reverse slope defense was Wellington's signature tactical innovation, though he'd learned elements of it from earlier commanders. The concept was elegant. Position your main force on the side of a hill facing away from the enemy. This accomplished several objectives simultaneously. First, enemy reconnaissance couldn't determine your strength or exact positions. They saw a ridge with perhaps some skirmishers, but your main battle line was invisible. Second, enemy artillery couldn't target troops they couldn't see. Artillery of this era fired on flat trajectories. You needed to see your target to hit it. Shells could fly over the ridge, but without observers to adjust fire, artillerists were shooting blind. Third, troops on the reverse slope were protected from long-range musket fire during the enemy's approach. But the real genius emerged when enemy forces attacked. They'd climb the forward slope, exhausting work that disordered formations and tired soldiers. They'd crest the ridge expecting to find defenders somewhere ahead, expecting time and space to deploy from marching formation into fighting formation. Instead, they'd find British lines already formed, at close range, rested and ready. The psychological shock was immense. You've just climbed a steep hill under fire from skirmishers, you're gasping for breath, your formation is stretched and disordered, and suddenly 300 muskets erupt 40 yards away, tearing into your packed column. Wellington used this tactic repeatedly throughout the Peninsular War and later at Waterloo. At Talavera in 1809, French columns attacked British positions on a ridge and were repulsed by troops appearing from reverse slope positions. At Salamanca in 1812, Wellington adapted the principle to offensive operations, keeping troops hidden until the perfect moment to strike. At Waterloo in 1815, the ultimate reverse slope defense shattered French attacks all day, culminating in the Imperial Guard's repulse. The tactic worked because it exploited human psychology, tactical doctrine, and the physical limitations of Napoleonic-era combat. The column versus line tactical debate was central to understanding why Wellington consistently defeated French armies. French tactical doctrine, refined through Revolutionary and Napoleonic wars, emphasized the attack column, battalion or brigade, organized in dense rectangular formations. Columns had genuine advantages. They could move quickly across battlefields, could wheel and maneuver more easily than extended lines, and had psychological impact. The sight of that massive block of men advancing behind drums and eagles, officers leading with swords drawn, could break enemy morale before contact. But columns had a fatal weakness against disciplined linear formations. Mathematics governed the confrontation. A French column might be 100 men wide and 20 ranks deep, 2,000 soldiers in a compact formation. But only the front rank and perhaps part of the second rank could effectively fire their muskets forward. That's perhaps 150 muskets engaging the enemy. A British two-rank line facing that column would extend much wider, perhaps 300 men shoulder to shoulder, all with clear lines of fire. 300 muskets firing against 150, and British infantry were trained to fire faster than their continental counterparts. British infantry drill emphasized rapid, controlled fire. Load and fire 15 times in 3 3/4 minutes. That was the standard during training exercises, though combat reduced this to perhaps 10 rounds in the same time due to stress and confusion. Still, that was 3 rounds per minute sustained. The famous thin red line, British infantry formed in 2 ranks rather than the 3 or 4 ranks used by other armies, maximized firepower whilst maintaining cohesion. Every musket could fire, every soldier could see and aim, and the line could advance or retreat whilst maintaining formation. Wellington's infantry were also exceptionally well trained in fire discipline. They didn't fire individually or at will. They fired by companies or battalions on command, creating devastating synchronized volleys. First rank fires, second rank fires, first rank reloaded, and fires again. The cycle continued until enemies broke or closed to bayonet range. French columns trying to deploy into line under this fire couldn't. Men were falling too fast. There wasn't space to extend formations whilst under fire, and the psychological stress of watching comrades fall whilst you couldn't effectively return fire was overwhelming. Portuguese army reforms deserve attention because Busaco validated their effectiveness. Before 1809, Portuguese regular forces were poorly trained, badly officered, equipped with obsolete weapons, and had been repeatedly defeated by French armies. Wellington and Marshal Beresford transformed them systematically. British officers were seconded to Portuguese regiments, bringing modern drill, tactics, and discipline. Portuguese soldiers were re-equipped with British muskets and standardized equipment. Training emphasized fire discipline, battalion movements, and integration with British forces rather than fighting as separate national units. By September 1810, Portuguese brigades were good enough to integrate into Wellington's line alongside British regulars. This wasn't just military necessity, it was psychological warfare. Wellington knew British officers and soldiers doubted Portuguese reliability, and French commanders certainly assumed Portuguese troops would break under pressure. Placing Portuguese brigades in critical sectors at Busaco, where they'd face the hardest fighting, sent a message. These troops are trusted to hold the line. When they did exactly that, repulsing French attacks and even counter-attacking successfully, the effect was transformative. Portuguese morale soared, British respect increased, and French assumptions about Portuguese weakness were shattered. The integration also had practical advantages. Portuguese officers and men knew the terrain better than British forces, could communicate with local civilians more effectively, and increased Wellington's overall troop numbers without requiring more reinforcements from Britain. By the end of the Peninsular War, Portuguese forces constituted nearly half of Wellington's army, and they'd proven themselves repeatedly in major battles. Artillery at Busaco played a supporting but important role. Wellington's guns were outnumbered by French artillery, but positioning mattered more than quantity. British and Portuguese batteries were positioned behind crests, where they were protected from counter-battery fire, but could shoot over the ridge at French formations climbing toward them. Canister shot, essentially large shotgun shells, was devastating against packed columns at close range. Artillery crews would wait until French forces were 200, 300 yards away, then fire canister that turned cannons into giant shotguns, each shot containing dozens of metal balls that spread in a cone pattern. Against dense columns, the effect was horrific. Light infantry and riflemen provided the screening force that made Wellington's system work. The 95th Rifles, armed with Baker rifles accurate to 300 yards, could kill French officers at ranges where muskets were useless. Remove the officers, and columns lost cohesion and control. Portuguese caçadores, light infantry trained similarly to British light troops, performed the same function, harassing French forces throughout their approach, then falling back to flanking positions once main battle lines engaged. The combined arms coordination was what made Wellington's defensive system greater than the sum of its parts. Light infantry harassed and disorganized attackers during the approach. Artillery hammered them as they climbed. Main battle lines delivered devastating close-range volleys. If French forces broke, cavalry pursued and turned retreat into rout, though at Busaco, terrain limited cavalry effectiveness. Each arm supported the others, creating a system where enemy forces were under constant effective fire from the moment they entered range until they broke and ran. French forces kept attacking Wellington, using column tactics for several reasons. First, tactical doctrine was deeply ingrained. The column attack had worked across Europe against multiple enemies, and military institutions are slow to change successful systems. Second, alternative tactics weren't obviously better. Attacking in line would expose more men to British fire during the approach, and required higher skill levels to maintain formation across rough terrain. Third, French commanders often believed they'd failed due to inadequate force or poor execution, rather than fundamental tactical problems. Ney at Busaco probably thought he'd lost because he hadn't committed enough troops, or because specific units had failed, rather than because the tactical approach itself was flawed. Napoleon himself never fully adapted to Wellington's methods because he never faced Wellington personally until Waterloo, and by then, it was too late. His marshals in Spain kept trying variations of the same attacks, hoping superior numbers or better timing would achieve breakthrough. But mathematics and terrain don't care about numbers beyond a certain point. If your tactical system exposes you to 3 times the enemy firepower, numerical superiority of 2 or even 3 to 1 isn't enough. The immediate impact of Busaco rippled through both armies with consequences that extended far beyond the casualty lists. For Wellington's forces, the victory validated everything they'd endured during the retreat through Portugal. British soldiers who'd burned Portuguese villages and watched civilians flee ahead of French forces finally understood the strategy. They weren't retreating from weakness. They were drawing the French into a trap. The victory boosted morale across the army, but more importantly, it proved the defensive system worked even when outnumbered substantially. For Portuguese troops, Busaco was transformative. They'd stood in line alongside British regulars, faced French veteran columns, and held their ground. Portuguese brigades that British officers had quietly doubted were now proven combat effective. Recruitment surged across Portugal. Young men who'd been hesitant to enlist now saw Portuguese forces as legitimate military organizations rather than cannon fodder for British strategy. Officers like General Pack, who commanded Portuguese brigades at Busaco, reported dramatic improvements in troop confidence and discipline after the battle. The Portuguese army would continue growing in size and effectiveness throughout the remaining years of the Peninsular War. British public opinion, which had been skeptical about Portuguese reliability, shifted as news of Busaco reached London. Newspaper accounts emphasized that Portuguese troops had fought alongside British forces and shared in the victory. This mattered politically because supporting Portugal was expensive, and British taxpayers needed to believe their money was funding effective allies rather than a lost cause. Busaco provided that reassurance at a critical moment. The French army's morale suffered correspondingly. Marshal Masséna's reputation, previously formidable, took damage he'd never fully recover. Officers and soldiers who'd climbed those slopes and been driven back repeatedly questioned French tactical doctrine in ways they hadn't before. When the withdrawal from Torres Vedras came 5 months later, French forces retreated with reduced confidence in their commanders and methods. The myth of French tactical invincibility, already weakened by previous peninsular defeats, continued eroding. Napoleon's reaction to Busaco and the subsequent Torres Vedras stalemate was fury. He'd sent one of his best marshals with a powerful army to crush British forces in Portugal, and Masséna had been systematically outmaneuvered. Napoleon's letters to Masséna through late 1810 and early 1811 were increasingly critical, demanding explanations for why the Portuguese campaign had stalled. The emperor refused to accept that Wellington had simply outgeneraled his marshal through superior strategy and tactics. In May 1811, Napoleon effectively relieved Masséna of command, replacing him with Marshal Marmont. Masséna would never command an army again, his career essentially ended by the Portuguese campaign. The strategic consequences were even more profound. Before Busaco and Torres Vedras, French strategy in Iberia assumed that overwhelming force could crush resistance. Portugal could be conquered, Spain could be pacified, and British forces could be driven into the sea through conventional military superiority. After Torres Vedras, those assumptions collapsed. Portugal was defensible, Spanish guerrillas couldn't be suppressed, and British forces, far from being driven out, were preparing to take the offensive. In 1812, Wellington advanced into Spain with an army that now included substantial Portuguese contingents. The Battle of Salamanca in July 1812 saw Wellington destroy Marshal Marmont's army through offensive maneuver, proving his system worked in attack as well as defense. Madrid was briefly liberated. By 1813, Wellington was pushing French forces back toward the Pyrenees, winning the decisive Battle of Vittoria in June that shattered French power in Spain. In 1814, Wellington invaded France itself, besieging French cities whilst Napoleon fought his final desperate campaigns against Allied armies converging on Paris. The Peninsular War, which Napoleon called his Spanish ulcer, drained French resources continuously from 1808 to 1814. 300,000 French troops were tied down fighting in Iberia, troops that couldn't be used against Austria, Prussia, or Russia. The financial cost was staggering. Millions of francs spent monthly maintaining armies that controlled cities but not countryside, that won tactical victories but never achieved strategic pacification. Busaco didn't cause all this, but it was a crucial link in the chain. It delayed French advance long enough for Torres Vedras to be completed, and Torres Vedras destroyed Masséna's army without Wellington needing to fight another major battle. The lines of Torres Vedras themselves became legendary in military history. The concept of prepared defensive lines wasn't new. Fortifications had existed since ancient warfare, but the scale and secrecy of Torres Vedras was unprecedented. 126 miles of fortifications built covertly over 18 months, employing thousands of workers, all hidden from French intelligence, until Masséna literally marched into view of them. Modern military strategists study Torres Vedras as an example of strategic deception and defensive warfare. The lesson is simple. Sometimes the best way to win isn't destroying enemy armies in battle, but creating situations where they destroy themselves through attrition, whilst you remain secure behind prepared defenses. Scorched earth as a strategic tool also proved effective despite its moral complications. Wellington's orders to burn crops and evacuate civilians caused immense hardship to Portuguese people, many of whom lost everything. But it worked. French armies couldn't live off the land when the land was barren. Their supply lines stretched back through hostile territory, harassed by guerrillas. The combination of scorched earth and fortified positions created an operational environment where French numerical superiority became irrelevant. The broader Napoleonic Wars context shows how interconnected campaigns were. Napoleon's decision to invade Russia in 1812 was partially motivated by needing a decisive victory somewhere after the grinding stalemate in Spain. The disastrous Russian campaign destroyed the Grande Armée and led directly to the War of the Sixth Coalition, where Austria and Prussia joined Russia and Britain against France. When Napoleon fought his desperate 1813 campaign in Germany, 300,000 French troops were still tied down in Spain fighting Wellington. Those troops could have changed outcomes at Leipzig or other critical battles. After Napoleon's first abdication in 1814, many of the French veterans who'd fought in Spain returned to France. When Napoleon escaped Elba and returned for the 100 Days in 1815, his army included soldiers who'd faced Wellington's defensive tactics repeatedly. At Waterloo on June 18, 1815, Napoleon attacked Wellington's positions using the same column tactics that had failed throughout the Peninsular War. Wellington used the same defensive system: reverse slope positioning, disciplined fire, coordinated counterattacks. The outcome was similar. French columns climbed toward British positions, were met with devastating fire, and were repeatedly repulsed. The Guards' final attack at Waterloo was essentially Busaco repeated on a larger scale. Modern military academies still study Busaco as an example of defensive warfare done correctly. The principles Wellington demonstrated remain relevant despite technological changes. Use terrain to your advantage. Position forces where they're protected but can engage effectively. Force enemies to attack under disadvantageous conditions. Maintain fire discipline and coordinated response. These concepts work whether you're fighting with muskets or modern weapons. The human cost of Busaco and the subsequent Portuguese campaign deserves acknowledgement. 4,500 French casualties in a single day. Men who died or were maimed climbing a ridge in a foreign country for an emperor's ambitions. 1,250 Allied casualties, each one a tragedy for family and comrades. Portuguese civilians who lost homes, livelihoods, and sometimes lives during the scorched earth retreat. The sanitized battle narratives of tactical brilliance and strategic success obscure the reality of thousands of individual tragedies. Busaco's battlefield today is preserved as a memorial and historical site. The ridge remains, though covered now with forest that didn't exist in 1810. The convent of Busaco still stands, converted to a luxury hotel, but containing a military museum. Walking the slopes French soldiers climbed, you understand viscerally why the attacks failed. It's steep, exhausting terrain, even without someone shooting at you. Monuments mark positions where units fought, and the Portuguese and British governments maintain the site as a reminder of the alliance that defeated Napoleon's ambitions in Iberia. Wellington's place among history's great commanders rests partly on battles like Busaco. He was never the brilliant offensive strategist that Napoleon was. His victories came from preparation, defensive positioning, and systematic exploitation of advantages rather than from inspirational maneuver or tactical innovation. But defensive brilliance is as valuable as offensive genius, perhaps more so. Wellington rarely lost battles because he rarely fought unless conditions favored him. When he did fight, his system maximized defender advantages and minimized risks. The final assessment of Busaco must acknowledge both the tactical masterpiece and the strategic brilliance. Tactically, Wellington positioned 25,000 troops to defeat 65,000 through superior use of terrain, better fire discipline, and integrated combined arms. Strategically, he fought the battle as a delaying action that bought time for Torres Vedras, then withdrew successfully to those prepared positions where French numerical superiority became meaningless. The battle wasn't about holding the ridge permanently. It was about inflicting casualties, boosting morale, and buying time. Wellington accomplished all three objectives perfectly. Busaco proved that outnumbered defenders with superior tactics and favorable terrain can defeat larger forces decisively. It validated Portuguese military reforms and proved that integrated multinational forces could fight effectively if properly trained and led. It contributed to French strategic failure in Portugal and ultimately to Napoleon's downfall. And it demonstrated principles of defensive warfare that remain relevant centuries later. That's why this battle, fought on a ridge in Portugal over 200 years ago, still matters and still deserves study today. The legacy of Busaco extends far beyond September 27, 1810, weaving through military history and strategic thought in ways that illuminate why this single defensive battle resonates centuries later. To understand its lasting importance, we need to examine how the battle influenced subsequent campaigns, shaped military doctrine, and provided lessons that transcend the specific technologies and armies involved. The immediate effect on the Peninsular War's trajectory was decisive. After Masséna's withdrawal from Torres Vedras in March 1811, French forces never regained strategic initiative in Portugal. Wellington, now confident in his army's capabilities and Portuguese reliability, began planning offensive operations. The siege of Badajoz in 1812, though costly, secured a crucial fortress. The Battle of Salamanca in July 1812 demonstrated Wellington's ability to conduct offensive warfare with the same skill he'd shown defensively. His army destroyed Marmont's French forces through rapid maneuver and concentrated attacks, proving the defensive specialist could also strike devastatingly when opportunities emerged. Portuguese forces continued proving their worth throughout these campaigns. At Salamanca, Portuguese infantry fought in the line alongside British regulars. At Vitoria in 1813, Portuguese brigades helped shatter King Joseph's army and drive French forces from Spain. By the 1814 invasion of France, Portuguese troops were besieging French fortresses and fighting battles on French soil. The transformation from unreliable auxiliaries in 1809 to combat-effective forces by 1812 owed much to the confidence gained at Busaco. The financial and political dimensions of the Peninsular War shifted after Busaco and Torres Vedras. British Parliament, which had been sceptical about continued Iberian involvement, authorized increased funding and reinforcements. The demonstration that Wellington could defend Portugal effectively against superior French forces justified the expense. Spanish resistance movements received more British support, weapons, supplies, and advisors, because the combination of Spanish guerrillas and Wellington's regular forces could actually win rather than merely survive. French strategic planning suffered permanent damage. Napoleon had assumed Iberia could be pacified through conventional military operations, occupy cities, defeat field armies, install compliant governments. The Portuguese campaign proved this assumption wrong. Guerrilla warfare, scorched earth, prepared defenses, and British military competence created an operational environment where French advantages in numbers and tactical doctrine were neutralized. Napoleon couldn't commit enough troops to simultaneously pacify Spain, defend Portugal against Wellington, and maintain forces for European campaigns. The Iberian commitment became a resource drain that weakened French capabilities elsewhere. The 1812 Russian campaign must be understood partly in context of peninsular frustrations. Napoleon needed a decisive victory somewhere to restore French strategic momentum. Spain was grinding stalemate. Austria was quiet but unreliable. Prussia was subdued but potentially hostile. Russia seemed the target where overwhelming force could achieve conclusive results. The disastrous outcome, loss of 400,000 troops, destruction of the Grande Armée, emboldening of enemies, traces partly to resources unavailable because they were committed to Spain, fighting an unwinnable war. Military theorists studying the Napoleonic Wars identified Wellington's defensive system as a coherent tactical doctrine worth systematic analysis. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian military philosopher, discussed defensive warfare's strategic value extensively in his work On War. While Clausewitz focused primarily on European campaigns, his observations about defense being the stronger form of warfare align with Wellington's peninsular practices. The defender chooses ground, prepares positions, forces the attacker to fight under disadvantageous conditions, and can transition to offense when opportunity arises. Antoine-Henri Jomini, the Swiss military theorist who served in French armies, wrote extensively about Napoleonic campaigns, including the Peninsular War. Jomini emphasized the importance of interior lines, concentration of force, and offensive action, concepts that Napoleon mastered. But Jomini also acknowledged that prepared defensive positions could neutralize offensive advantages, particularly when defenders exploited terrain intelligently. Busaco featured prominently in Jomini's analysis as an example of terrain determining tactical outcomes, regardless of numerical superiority. British military doctrine adopted Wellington's defensive principles as standard practice. Throughout the 19th century, British forces facing numerically superior enemies would seek defensive positions on reverse slopes, position artillery behind crests, and use disciplined fire to repel attacks. The system worked in various colonial conflicts where British regulars faced larger indigenous forces. The principle remained: superior training and tactics could defeat superior numbers if positions were chosen carefully. The American Civil War showed Wellington's influence across the Atlantic. Confederate General Robert E. Lee employed reverse slope defenses at Fredericksburg in 1862, where Union forces attacking uphill suffered devastating casualties. Union General George Meade used similar positioning at Gettysburg in 1863, holding elevated positions and repelling Confederate assaults. Both commanders had studied Napoleonic warfare, and Wellington's defensive successes informed their tactical choices. The First World War's trench warfare represented an extreme evolution of defensive doctrine, where technology had made offensive operations prohibitively costly. While trenches differed vastly from Napoleonic ridge defenses, the underlying principle was identical. Prepared defensive positions with coordinated firepower could slaughter attacking forces regardless of their courage or numbers. The deadlock on the Western Front from 1914-1918 demonstrated that without tactical or technological solutions to defensive superiority, wars became attritional nightmares. Modern military analysis of Busaco focuses on several enduring lessons. First, terrain matters enormously. Technology changes weapons, but geography remains constant. Hills provide observation and fields of fire. Steep slopes exhaust attackers. Reverse slopes protect defenders. These principles apply whether you're fighting with muskets or machine guns. Military staffs studying potential battlefields still evaluate terrain using concepts Wellington understood instinctively. Second, training and discipline multiply effectiveness. Wellington's British infantry weren't superhuman. They were well-trained soldiers who executed standard drills reliably under stress. Portuguese troops became effective not through inherent superiority, but through systematic training in British methods. The lesson remains relevant. Properly trained forces with standard procedures outperform numerically superior but poorly trained enemies. Third, integrated combined arms produce synergistic effects. Light infantry, artillery, line infantry, and cavalry each had roles at Busaco, and their coordination created a defensive system stronger than any single arm alone. Modern militaries organize combined arms teams for exactly this reason. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air support working together are exponentially more effective than the same units operating independently. Fourth, logistics determine operational possibilities. Wellington's forces were supplied from the sea through ports British naval power controlled. French forces relied on overland supply through hostile territory. This logistical asymmetry meant Wellington could sustain operations indefinitely, whilst French forces slowly starved. Modern military doctrine emphasizes logistics as foundational to strategy, because battles like Busaco demonstrated that even tactical brilliance fails without sustainable supply. Fifth, strategic patience can defeat operational aggression. Wellington didn't need to destroy Masséna's army at Busaco. He needed to delay French advance and inflict casualties. The withdrawal to Torres Vedras demonstrated strategic patience. Sitting behind fortifications whilst French forces withered required resisting pressure to do something offensively. The lesson applies broadly. Sometimes the best action is waiting for enemies to exhaust themselves against your prepared positions. The human dimension of Busaco deserves final reflection. Behind the statistics and tactical analyses were thousands of individual soldiers experiencing terror, pain, triumph, and loss. French troops climbing those slopes showed extraordinary courage, attacking repeatedly despite watching comrades fall. Portuguese soldiers standing in line for the first time against veteran French columns demonstrated that ordinary people can become reliable soldiers through training and leadership. British infantry maintaining fire discipline whilst French columns approached showed the value of steady professionalism in crisis. Wellington himself deserves reassessment beyond the simple great general label. He was methodical rather than brilliant, defensive rather than aggressive, systematic rather than inspirational. His strength was preparation, studying terrain obsessively, positioning troops meticulously, ensuring logistics functioned reliably. He won through competence rather than genius, which might be more impressive because competence is achievable where genius isn't. Busaco's battlefield preservation allows modern visitors to experience the terrain physically. Walking those slopes, you understand why French attacks failed. Standing on the ridge's crest, you see the reverse slope positions and comprehend the tactical advantage. The monuments remind you this wasn't abstract military history, but real men fighting and dying for causes they perhaps barely understood. The Portuguese maintained the site respectfully, honoring both Portuguese and British defenders whilst acknowledging French courage. The battle's ultimate significance is that it proved defensive warfare, properly executed, could defeat numerically superior forces decisively. This wasn't Thermopylae, where defenders died heroically in futile last stands. This was systematic destruction of enemy forces through superior tactics, better training, and intelligent use of terrain. Wellington fought to win, not to die gloriously, and he created a system that won repeatedly across years of warfare. Busaco demonstrated that 25,000 well-positioned troops could hold a ridge against 65,000 attackers, inflicting triple casualties whilst maintaining their own force intact. That mathematical disparity, one defender equaling nearly 3 attackers, came not from individual heroism, but from systematic tactical advantages exploited ruthlessly. The lesson remains: in warfare, position and preparation matter as much as courage and numbers. Wellington understood this profoundly, and Busaco was his masterclass in making that understanding operational. That's why this battle, fought on a September morning 2 centuries ago, still teaches us about conflict, strategy, and the enduring principles that determine who wins when armies clash.